Shalom. I want to give all praises and honor and glory to the only true God of heaven and earth, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Israel, whose true name is Yahweh, and to his only begotten Son, the Messiah, the Lamb of God, that taketh away the sins of Israel by the shedding of his own blood, whose true name is Yahweh Shai, and double honors to my elders and teachers, and great millstone, and honors to all the prophets and teachers that carry the spirit of faith and the spirit of truth within them. My name is Hear My Speech concerning the truth, that is the word of the living God, which word pertains to you Israelites, which are you so-called Negroes, Hispanics, Latinos, and Native Indians, even you Israelites who may have the appearance of the heathen, who may have the identity of the heathen, are really descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And spirit beareth witness of your spirit, for your faith becomes the thing that the spirit have testified by the prophets, by the apostles of old, who have long ago written of the just living by faith, on how faith is gathered as a treasure. So your faith becomes a sign that you may be an elect and that you are an Israelite. Now, the title of this lesson will be Terrifyingly Beautiful and the Mark of His Goodness. Again, the title will be Terrifyingly Beautiful and the Mark of His Goodness. Now, in these last days, Yahweh Bahashem Yahweh Shai Bahashem Ruchach Wadash is working the work among the heathens, among the nations, of people whom He hath cursed. He will also give salvation and blessing to. And His salvation will be marvelous, which marvelous means to be beyond one's grasp or understanding, to be surpassing, basically. And when this salvation comes, it will be a worldwide event. It will be so striking that everyone will see it. A great number of you Israelites who believe and live by your faith and will be saved by your faith will be gathered into what the scriptures call the chariots of salvation, which the world call today UFOs, wrongly associating them with a myth, a lie, a fiction known as aliens. Really, these so-called UFOs are operated by the angels, and they come from the heavens. And these same chariots, these so-called UFOs, again, will be the very instruments that will gather the elect, that will hold or contain the elect away from the destruction that will happen in the same season. Nuclear destruction, and ultimately the wrath of the Lamb, Yahweh Shai, which will be expressed by fire. And the very glory of those chariots, they are, again, marvelous. They are beautiful. Shining lights, likened unto a fire, likened unto a brightness, a brilliant brightness. And these same things, when they come, it's going to be a terrifying presence. Also, what they will do is, terrible. These same chariots will be able to pour out a destructive force. Um, let's go to the book of Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 7. This is the book of Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 7, verse. Salakia, bear with me. Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 7, verse 25. For she is the breath of the power of God and a pure influence flowing from the glory of the Almighty. Therefore can no undefiled thing fall into her. Now this is speaking about wisdom. Now in this chapter, in this book, wisdom represents, the divine power, the power of Yahweh Bashim Yahweh Shai. And it also represents his goodness. Which there's, the scriptures tell you in the same chapter that wisdom is manifold. So you think about the laws, statutes, commandments. That's according to, divine inspiration. His will and his spirit. The law came in a marvelous fashion. You think about the tabernacle, the temple, the Ark of the Covenant, the service of the priesthood. You think about Yahweh Shai himself. There's many aspects of wisdom. It's just not a logical, aspect. It's more than a logical aspect. When you go into the scriptures. Let's read it again, verse 25. It says, for she is the breath of the power of God. And yeah, you think about the angels themselves, the holy angels, and the chariots which they operate. That's all an aspect, a manifestation of divine power, of the power of Yahweh Bashim Yahweh Shai. How, you go into, the account of Lot. As I said, wisdom, represents God's goodness. As I'm going to read, the Lord expressed his goodness by sending forth angels to warn and to gather Lot and his family. So that's an aspect of wisdom. An aspect of wisdom is what? The very expression of God's power and his goodness. And it's an omnipotent force. It's an omnipotent force. It says, for she is the breath of the power of God and a pure influence flowing from the glory of the Almighty. Yeah, the focus of this lesson is the chariots, man. The salvation, which is bigger than the chariots. Yahweh Shai and the angels will come with the chariots, riding upon the chariots of heaven, which the world call UFOs. And that will be a manifestation of God's power and his glory. In fact, is it not written that Yahweh Shai is the fullness of God? The brightness of his majesty. Is it not written in the book of Colossians that in him dwelleth the fullness of the Godhead? In other words, the divine quality and essence Yahweh Shai was given in full. He was bestowed his majesty and glory and fullness by the Father, Yahweh. So when Yahweh Shai come and the angels and the chariots under his belt, that's going to be like witnessing God with our very eyes. And all that glory, and it's going to be so terrifying. All nations are going to mourn and be shaken at the very presence, of this invasion, which is known as the second coming. The second appearance of Yahweh Shai to this earth. It says, therefore can no undefiled thing fall into her, for she is the brightness of the everlasting light, the unspotted mirror of the power of God, and the image of his goodness. And Yahweh Shai and the angels, riding upon those chariots, that's going to be a manifestation, an expression of God's goodness. Because the elect, believers, are going to ascend into these chariots, as it is written in the book of Revelation, chapter 11. They're going to ascend up into the cloud. In fact, let's go to the book of Habakkuk real quick. As I said, these chariots, which the world call UFOs, they're known in the scriptures as the chariots of salvation. This is Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 8. Was the Lord displeased with the rivers? Was thine anger against the rivers? Was thy wrath against the sea? And this is symbolic. The rivers and the sea, represents the nations, the world, the multitudes of people. And when Yahweh Shai come, they tell you in the book of Revelation chapter 19 that he's going to war. He's going to wage war, in righteousness. So he's coming to do violently, against the nations, in righteousness and in judgment, in justice, in equity, So Yahweh Shai, he's coming to destroy, to execute judgment, but he's also coming to save. As we going to read further on, it says, that thou didst ride upon thine horses and thy chariots of salvation. So Yahweh Shai and the angels, they're going to come with what the world today knows as UFOs. In the scriptures, they're known as the chariots of Yahweh Bashem Yahweh Shah, they're known as the chariots of Israel. But the very function, uh, one of the functions of these chariots will be to gather, to hold, to contain, to be an abode, a dwelling place for the elect in this time of destruction and doom. Because salvation is what? Safety from danger. So it's also going to be a time of destruction and a time of salvation. In the same season. And the very appearance of those chariots, which will come in a great number of the scriptures to tell you that, behold, he cometh with clouds, and every eye shall see him. They tell you that in the book of Revelation, chapter 1. Let's get that real quick. So, this ultimately signify that, this scripture down by the gate in the book of Revelation, chapter 1, it signify that the coming of the Lord Yahweh Shai will be a worldwide, attraction. All nations and all peoples will see it. And this signify the great size of the chariots that Yahweh Shai and the angels will come with, but also the great number, the great number of the chariots as well. Because it is written in the book of Revelation, in the book of 2nd Esdras 13, that Yahweh Shai will come with the thousands of heaven, with the heavenly host. So a great number of angels will come behind Yahweh Shai. So we can imagine, we can picture, thousands and thousands, even more than that. I'm probably underestimating it, in my speech. Great number of chariots in great size, filling the heights of heaven, the heights of the sky, to the point where the four corners of heaven, or the four parts of the earth will see it, will witness it. This is Revelation chapter 1, verse 7. It says, behold, he cometh with clouds, and every eye shall see him, and they also which pierced him, and all kindreds of the earth shall wail because of him. Even so, Amen. So it's going to be a period of wailing, of mourning, of lamenting because of the destruction that Yahweh Shai will execute, will bring forth. And the very presence of it, the very sight of it will be terrible. It will be terrifying. Well, the scriptures tell you in the book of Matthew to add on, my statement. In the book of Matthew, Salaki. Matthew chapter 24, verse. Damn, what is it? All right, come. This is Luke, not Matthew. Luke chapter 21, verse 26. It says, men's hearts failing them for fear and for looking after those things which are coming in the earth. For the powers of heaven shall be shaken. And then shall they see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. So it's going to be so terrifying that men's hearts will fail them. By the different signs, omens of his coming. But even his very presence, his very appearance, very sight of Yahweh shining angels with those chariots will cause men's hearts to fail, you know? So going back to Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 7, it says, "For she is the brightness of the everlasting light, the unspotted mirror of the power of God and the image of his goodness." Now, in the Apostle Paul, in the book of First Corinthians, have written that Yahweh Shai, he is the power of God and the wisdom of God, you know? So Yahweh Shai, when he comes, we're going to witness, you know, you know, God's majesty, but also his goodness, because wisdom is also a representation of his goodness as well. It's associated with his goodness, you know? As I'm reading, "For she is the brightness of the everlasting light, the unspotted mirror of the power of God and the image of his goodness." Just like, you think about the law, statutes, commandments, that was for our spirit, that was for our wellness, our goodness, you know? So through faith in Yahweh Shai, we're going to witness salvation that's going to come in a marvelous way. Verse 29 says, "For she is more beautiful than the sun, and above all the order of the stars, being compared with the light, she is found before it." So, as the title, terrifyingly beautiful in the mark of his goodness, you know. Let's go to the book of Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 10. Now, when we go into this chapter, it speaks about wisdom, and this proves that in specific chapters, wisdom is more than a logical, and moral dimension. Wisdom is also, you know, uh, you know, in certain chapters, represents, God's power, and his goodness. It's associated with those things with his authority and his sovereignty, or the very expression of his power and goodness, Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 10, verse 17. It says, "Render to the righteous a reward of their labors, and guided them in a marvelous way, and was unto them for a cover by day, and a light of stars in the night season." Now, this was talking about when the Lord delivered the children of Israel from the land of Egypt, from captivity. The Lord led us into the wilderness and through the wilderness by a cover. And when you read about it, it speaks about a cloud, you know, that was like a guide unto us, and a light, a pillar of light by night, as a guide unto us to lead us in a way, which was an expression of divine power and goodness of God. This is Exodus chapter 13, verse 21. It says, "And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of a cloud to lead them the way, and by night a pillar of fire to give them light to go by day and night. He took not away the pillar of the cloud by day, nor the pillar of fire by night from before the people." So, that was a chariot, through the spirit and power of Yahweh Bashem Yahweh Shai, we understand that was a chariot. What today the people will call a UFO or UAP. And it was being operated by, if you can receive it, by Yahweh Shai himself. Because Yahweh Shai was the angel of God's presence. The scriptures, there's so many scriptures that proves that. He was the spirit, the angel of God that brought forth the water from the rock, that brought forth the bread from heaven, that rained bread from heaven, manna from heaven. And there's some of the scriptures that implies that. So Yahweh Shai, he was the very angel, representative of God among the children of Israel. He was the writer or the operator of the chariot. So going back to, Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 10, verse 17, and unto them for cover by day and the light of stars in the night season. So, Yahweh Shai, he's, going back to the folks at this lesson, terrifyingly beautiful in the mark of his goodness. So we're going to see the manifestation of God's goodness, of God's love, of his mercy via salvation, you know, again, because the very life and death and resurrection of Yahweh Shai was a manifestation or an expression of God's goodness. Because through his blood, we are healed, you know. We have the remission of sins and the forgiveness of sins, and through his resurrection, we witness God's power, you know. So in Yahweh Shai, we come to the understanding of God. The scriptures tell you that in the face of Yahweh Shai is a display of God's, grace, or is a display of his glory, so just showing you, giving you an idea of, of a more understanding of wisdom in these chapters, is more than a moral and logical dimension. It also represents, or is the expression, you know, uh, of God's power and goodness, you know. So you think about the angels as well, the holy angels. They're also an aspect of God's, of glory, of God's power. They are the many aspects of God's power, you know, because the Lord does things via the angels, The angels are servants, they're ministers, they're messengers, The Lord saved Job, the Lord saved Lot via angels, you know. So just give you an idea of, what wisdom, represents in this chapter, in these chapters, Um, um, let's go to the book of um, Salakia. Let's go see real quick. Well, let's go to the book of Revelation, chapter 11, real quick. Revelation chapter 11. Remember in the book of Exodus, they tell you that the Lord was among us, in a cloud by day, which was, Yahweh shining a chariot. Revelation chapter 11, verse um, 12, it says, "And they heard a great voice from heaven, saying unto them, Come up hither. And they ascended up to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies beheld them." So as it is, is, in the book of Exodus, the Lord was among us in a cloud by day. It's speaking about a chariot, which is a celestial, way of traveling, you know. And the angels, they are the operator or the riders of these chariots. Now, in the book of Isaiah, chapter 63, it says, and their enemies beheld them. So it's going to be a worldwide, you know, um, you know, sight. You know, they're going to see millions of Israelites being gathered into a chariot, you know, around the world, not just here in America, but in different parts of the earth, because you have believers scattered amongst the nations, you know, because you have Israelites scattered amongst the nations. This book of Isaiah, chapter 63, verse 1. Who is this that cometh from Edom with dyed garments from Basra? This is signifying the return of Yahweh Shai. Now, it's also signifying the vengeance that Yahweh Shai will execute, upon Edom, who is the so-called white man today, whose central or center of power is America. You know, it's Western world, NATO. It says, think about Amalek as well. It says, who is this that cometh from Edom with dyed garments from Basra? So Yahweh Shai is going to execute vengeance upon Edom. Dyed garments signifying bloodshed. In war, you would have blood on your garments. It says, this that is glorious in his apparel. Yeah, because when Yahweh Shai come, people are not going to see his physical form, but what they will see is those chariots which Yahweh Shai and the angels will operate and ride within. So we want to see, chariots, which the world call UFOs. I cannot tell you, every description of them, but be sure to understand that they will be bright. They will be, shining in glory. They may appear as fire. They may appear as, uh, um, you have, different descriptions throughout the Bible. You have a spaceship, that the common standard of what a UFO look like. You have some that look like fire. You have some described as looking at like emerald, a shining emerald green. You know, some look like you know, metallic. Some have a metallic look to them. But either way, these chariots they're going to shine, with brilliant light. No matter the appearance they have, or the description they have, it's going to be a glorious sight to the point where men's heart is going to fail. People screaming, people, passing out. You know, this that is glorious in his apparel, traveling in the greatness of his strength. Yeah, traveling in the greatness of his strength. What is that talking about? Um, the chariots, and the number of chariots he's coming with. Because when you think about in ancient times, a king is measured by how many troops, by how many soldiers, by how many horses, by how many chariots he has. Well, Yahweh Shai is coming with a great number of angels and a great number of chariots. And they're going to be very, large, very great in size and great in number, you know. It's his eye that's speaking righteousness, mighty to save. And that's exactly what the Lord's going to do, to save. Also to execute vengeance, So I'm gonna close off on that, you know. Lord willing, this lessons edifying. We'll give all praise and honor and glory to Yahweh Bashem, Yahweh Shah Shalom.